Between 1907 and 1981, approximately 65,000 Americans were forcibly sterilized under state eugenics laws that relied in part on intelligence test scores to identify those deemed unfit to reproduce. In Buck v. Bell, the Supreme Court upheld Virginia's sterilization law in 1927, with Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes writing that 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Intelligence testing was not just misused, it was weaponized. Understanding this history is inseparable from understanding the tests. Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon developed the first practical intelligence test in 1905 at the request of the French government, specifically to identify children who would benefit from additional educational support. Binet was explicit and careful about the limitations of his test. It measured current academic performance, not innate intelligence. It was meant for educational use, not for ranking or labeling children, and he explicitly warned against viewing scores as fixed or immutable. The test was designed to help children, not to categorize, sort, or exclude them. Lewis Terman at Stanford University revised and Americanized Binet's test as the Stanford-Binet in 1916, creating the intelligence quotient, IQ, as mental age divided by chronological age, multiplied by 100. Terman was a committed eugenicist who believed the test measured innate, inherited intelligence and argued for its use in classifying, sorting, and ultimately regulating reproduction based on test scores. He co-developed the Army Alpha and Beta tests that classified over 1.7 million World War I recruits, legitimizing the idea that intelligence testing should determine people's roles in society. The American eugenics movement of the early 20th century embraced intelligence testing as scientific validation for pre-existing prejudices about race, ethnicity, and class. Henry Goddard's testing of immigrants at Ellis Island in 1913 produced the astonishing claim that 83% of Jews, 80% of Hungarians, and 79% of Italians were feeble-minded, results that reflected test translation problems, cultural unfamiliarity, and poor administration rather than genuine cognitive differences. These results were used to support the Immigration Restriction Act of 1924 and state sterilization laws. The American Psychological Association's ethical standards for psychological testing require multiple protections. Informed consent is required. Test takers must understand what is being measured, how results will be used, and who will have access to scores. Tests must be used only for validated purposes. A test validated for clinical diagnosis should not be used for personnel selection without separate validation. Results must be interpreted by qualified professionals who understand the test's limitations, population norms, and measurement error. Raw scores alone are never sufficient for consequential decisions. Psychological tests are developed within specific cultural contexts and may contain items that systematically advantage members of the culture in which they were developed. Vocabulary, verbal analogies, general knowledge, and situational judgment items can all reflect cultural familiarity that is unequally distributed across groups. Detecting cultural bias requires item-level statistical analyses, examining whether items show differential item functioning, performing worse for some groups after controlling for overall ability. Bias reduction efforts include removing culturally loaded items, using culturally appropriate norms, and developing culture-reduced tests. Standardized testing requires test security, controlling access to specific items so that all test takers have equal opportunity to demonstrate their true ability rather than advanced knowledge of specific items. When test content is widely exposed, scores inflate without corresponding ability increases, score inflation rather than learning. This is increasingly challenging in the digital age, where test questions can be shared globally within hours of an exam. Test developers respond by creating large item banks, administering different forms, and updating content regularly. Even granting a substantial genetic contribution to IQ. Using this to justify differential opportunity or reproductive restrictions involves a fundamental error, the is-ought fallacy. The fact that individual differences in IQ have genetic contributors does not imply that differential treatment is justified, that measured differences are permanent, or that higher IQ individuals deserve better life outcomes. Moreover, the genetic architecture of intelligence involves thousands of small effect genes interacting with environmental factors in complex ways, not simple, identifiable genetic differences between groups that could ground discriminatory policy. Despite their history of misuse, intelligence tests have genuine value when used appropriately. Clinical assessment of cognitive strengths and weaknesses guides educational planning and intervention for individuals with learning disabilities, intellectual disability, and giftedness. Cognitive assessments inform neuropsychological evaluation after brain injury, stroke, or suspected dementia. Research applications advance understanding of cognitive development, aging, and the impact of interventions. The key is using tests only for validated purposes, with qualified interpretation, informed consent, and awareness of cultural factors that affect performance. The history of intelligence testing is simultaneously a history of genuine scientific achievement and catastrophic misuse. Binet created a tool to help children. Eugenicists weaponized it to harm them. Understanding this history is not an argument against testing. It is an argument for humility, ethical restraint, and insistence that tests be used only for the purposes they have actually been validated for by people qualified to interpret them.